Chapter 7. Upon the Steps of Phalaris. The winds that were once blowing the canopy over the village of Telerifel had halted. The swaying of the trees were now replaced with deafening silence. The villagers, once toiling away in the many gardens, stopped at the sudden change in the atmosphere. At the edge of the city, thick vines emerged from the ground. The citizens and followers of Phalaris stood up from working in their gardens to inspect the vines, though what was being carried by them gave all of them pause. The crushed bodies of two priests of Talgus, along with the headless torso of two more priests, was presented to the citizens as another vine came up from the ground with the body of the abbot. The city of Telerifel was stunned at the sight of the mangled corpses. "What is this treachery?" inquired Sarast, the elder of the village, as she placed her eyes on the 5 bodies. She stared at the priests in disbelief as another strange sight emerged from the forest. A dryad, a creature that rarely left the shadows of the canopy, came out into the open and approached the village elder. The dryad purred and made some soft noises, prompting Sarast to turn to several of the others. Sarast's eyes lit up, surprised at what she was hearing from the woodland creature. "They found the children. We need to follow her," she announced to the onlookers. The dryad stepped away from the villagers and led them toward their loved ones. The villagers scampered away and into the forest as Drusilla emerged from the brush. With vines pushing her into the village past any of the onlooking villagers, she was able to make it into the courtyard of the Grand Temple undetected. Several of the followers were still in the courtyard tending to the plants as Drusilla, with her eyes still glowing prominently, strutted past them toward the stairs. She climbed them with a mild pace and made it to the doors, which were already open. She stood in the doorway of the Grand Temple for a few moments and surveyed the area. All of the priests stood still, affixing their eyes on the god-touched as she stood prominently before them. "Where is he?" asked Drusilla sternly. "Where is who, Madame Whisperleaf?" inquired one of the priests closest to her, a young female with bright, red hair and rosy cheeks. Drusilla smiled warmly and tilted her head slightly to the side innocently. Her eyes glowed a more vibrant green as she raised her hand with her palm out toward the young priest. Vines emerged from the ground without warning and with a frantic pace to wrap around the ankles and shins of the young priest. Her eyes grew wide as she gazed down at the ensnaring vines. "Drusilla, release her!" shouted Tandric from one of the side rooms. The god-touched servant smiled and pulled the vines away from the priest's feet. She turned to see Tandric coming into the main area of the temple with Vitriolus beside him. "Oh good, you're both here," she announced sarcastically. "I was hoping I would have both of you here." Vitriolus looked away from Drusilla and walked toward the door as Tandric moved in front of her. "It's quite bold of you to come barging into His Excellency's Grand Temple. I wonder what's gotten to you. What of the forest, Drusilla? What did you find?" Drusilla laughed. "You know what I found. Don't play stupid," she chided. "You know what the forces of Talgus were in that forest." Tandric stood perfectly still and kept a stoic face upon hearing Drusilla speak. The god-touched servant breathed heavily as she fumed and began to pace in front of him. Now, High Priest, why would you ever let something so sinister come into our forest?" inquired Drusilla as she paced in front of Tandric. The High Priest scoffed. "Do you think I opened the door for them?" "I don't think you did much to stop them from coming in," countered Drusilla harshly. "Your lack of action and your incompetence to what is actually happening in the forest around Telerifel led to the death of several creatures of Phalaris as well as several followers' children. All of that blood is on your hand, High Priest." Tandric chuckled and shook his head disrespectfully. "The lives of those that walk on 2 or 4 legs is not my prerogative, God-touched, nor should it be yours." Tandric folded his arms across his chest defiantly while Drusilla continued to pace in front of him, almost as if she was sizing him and preparing to strike. "The creatures of Phalaris that you seem to be obsessed with do not serve a purpose or a job that is fitting of my protection nor my care, Whisperleaf. The job of those that dwell in the forest is not to fight battles against our foes or wage a war for the safety of our followers, but to protect the forest and ensure that it thrives," explained Tandric calmly, noticing that Drusilla's ire was growing. "The creatures of Phalaris are charged with ensuring that the flora thrive, even at their expense." Drusilla halted her pacing and bit her bottom lip. She composed herself briefly as everyone in the Grand Temple continued to watch the encounter nervously. "So every nymph or dryad should be sacrificed as long as a single blade of grass can thrive?" asked Drusilla rhetorically. "The lives of the creatures that serve our god are nothing but a currency that you can spend to ensure the radiance and majestic beauty of the forest?" Tandric kept his arms across his chest and nodded. "That's precisely right, Drusilla," he affirmed coldly. "All that matters is the forests of Dunai thrive. No matter the creature and no matter how close they are to you, they are only worth the cost that keeps the forest healthy." Tandric unfolded his arms and took a step toward Drusilla. I don't care if thousands of nymphs die so long as one tree survives. Drusilla screamed loudly in anger as the high priest provoked her. 2 thick vines came up from the ground, with the high priest holding out his hands to make them both decay in front of Drusilla. She summoned a third from behind him, which met the same fate. However, a 4th vine made contact. After 3 vines were stopped by the high priest, Drusilla summoned a small one beneath his feet that wrapped around his shoes snugly. Before he could react, the small vine pulled to his left and dropped Tandric's body to the ground. Drusilla summoned 2 more vines from beneath Tandric that wrapped around him quickly, engulfing his entire body before he could decay them. Grass grew around his body, but the high priest could not summon anything that would assist in defeating Drusilla. He was in her grasp and at her mercy as the vines constricted around his body. It's time for a new high priest, Tandric, seethed Drusilla as she stared into Tandric's fading eyes. It's time for someone to take charge who truly understands the plight of the forest. Drusilla leaned forward as the vines wrapped around Tandric tighter. With all the followers of Valorous ensnared in Drusilla's vines and unable to move, Drusilla placed her lips next to Tandric's right ear and sighed loudly. Every second you are still on Dunai is a second wasted in the life of the forest, she said coldly. Goodbye, Tandric. Drusilla, no! Screamed Tandric as the vines wrapped around him further. Her glowing eyes looked away from her prey as she turned toward the abbot. Tandric Gertrans was pulled into the ground by the vines, where the sounds of his screams were muffled before they were suddenly silent. Drusilla shifted her vibrant, emerald eyes to another area of the Grand Temple as several priests appeared ready to attack the God-Touched for attacking their high priest. Without any warning, Drusilla summoned vines from the ceiling and from the ground to ensnare all of the priests who appeared to be coming toward her, even without her knowing for sure. Some of the priests shifted their weight amongst their legs and had no intentions of coming toward Drusilla, but it didn't matter. Only those who cowered in fear and remained perfectly still were left alive. Bodies were constricted and crushed before being dropped to the ground. Bodies piled up one on top of another as Drusilla's vines did the job for her. Nearly 100 of priests and followers of Valorous were killed by her constricting creations. With only a few priests remaining, and the Grand Temple filled with the vines summoned by Drusilla, the magnificent structure possessed an aura that matched a graveyard. 2 priests cowered behind a large vase, while another stood in front of the stairs. In the doorway that led outside, the abbot, Vitriolus, stood still, waiting for her moment against Drusilla. She had already faced her wrath earlier. Drusilla turned toward the exit and away from the vast amount of the vines. She approached Vitriolus calmly, but with a sense of determination about her. I told you earlier that you would one day become the high priest. Vitriolus, I suppose that day is today, announced Drusilla. Vitriolus exhaled loudly. But the high priest is chosen by Valorous, she muttered. Drusilla reached forward as Vitriolus cowered. The God-Touched placed her hand on Vitriolus's shoulder and smiled warmly. The high priest has now been chosen by me, and I'm sure our God will understand, she stated confidently. We're in an open war with the forces of Talchus now, and we need a high priest who understands that the sanctity of life is equal to the vibrance of the forest. Do you understand me? Vitriolus blinked slowly and nodded her head softly. Yes, ma'am, I understand, she said. But what if Valorous... He won't, interrupted Drusilla as she patted Vitriolus on the shoulder and walked past her. And if he does, he can come find me. He needs a high priest who will protect his followers as well as the forest, and I just provided him with that. Drusilla walked away from Vitriolus, leaving her and the few priests to clean up the mess that she made. She moved down the stairs and into the courtyard where none of the followers toiling earlier could be found. News of her assault had traveled already, and she was being allowed to leave without anyone watching. She stepped through the courtyard and out into the dirt street of Telerifel to see some of the villagers emerging from the forest, all carrying bodies of the children that were killed. While several men carried the bodies of the children, the mothers of the children walked beside them. Drusilla glanced over to see Turst among them. The blacksmith's wife was crying profusely as she looked at her son's crushed body. Drusilla shrugged and kept moving, refusing to stop and talk to the villagers. Turst glanced up from her son's body, noticing the God-Touched walking past them on her way to her cottage. Madam Whisperleaf, please, wait, shouted Turst. Saras glanced up along with the rest of the villagers as the blacksmith's wife jogged toward Drusilla, who was still walking toward her cottage. Drusilla never broke stride as Turst ran and stood in front of her. Madam Whisperleaf, what happened to my son? Drusilla scoffed and kept walking, stepping to the side of Turst and showing no interest in having a conversation with any of them. Drusilla, please, what happened? Drusilla halted briefly and turned her head around to look at Turst. She locked eyes with the follower of Valkus and smirked, with the emerald hue from her eyes still glowing vibrantly. He died. Isn't it obvious? She answered rudely before turning and walking away from Turst and continuing on to her cottage. Turst stood perfectly still as tears came over her again. The bodies of the fallen children were being lined up, with Saras directing each one to a different spot on the ground. With Drusilla several feet away and almost out of sight, a priest sprinted away from the grand temple and over to the village elder. She killed the high priest, whispered the priest in Saras' ear. She killed almost everyone. Saras' eyes widened in fear as she turned back to see Drusilla completely out of view. What of the abbot? Drusilla told Vitriolus that she is now the high priest, continued the priest softly. What do we do? Saras smirked and shook her head. You're the priest. You're supposed to tell me that, she said in jest before turning back to the bodies and sighing. The sight of the dead children gave her pause, but she knew she had to stay focused. The village required it. If she murdered all of the priests, then her scales are not aligned. She will soon become the prey of Vesia's hunter. Saras paused and the priest appeared confused. She turned to look at the young man, smiling at his ignorance. Drusilla Whisperleaf has become the prey of Ebolus Mertrand. Script Grid Publishing would like to thank you for listening to By Gods and Kings. For more information on By Gods and Kings, please feel free to visit our website, bygodsandkings.com. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, both at By Gods and Kings.